Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to the first meeting of the Lincolnshire Schools Forum. My name is Katrina Cope. I am the Senior Democratic Service Officer who provides support to the forum. I would like to confirm that today's proceedings will be audio broadcasted and recorded. Can I please remind members of our meeting of meeting etiquette? When invited to speak by the chairman, the member officer should unmute their microphone and switch on their video. When the member officer has finished speaking, they should mute their microphone and switch off their video. This will then help the flow of the meeting. If during debate a member officer would like to ask a further question or raise a point, they are requested to use the chat function. And just to speak as a comment, requests will be collated by Nicholas, the Democratic Services Officer. Nicholas will also indicate in the chat when the item has begun. Members are requested to indicate in the chat function if they are leaving the meeting. If a member loses connection during the meeting, it is recommended that they end the call using the red phone icon and rejoin via the meeting link provided. If, however, a member does lose connection, the chairman will pause the meeting for a period to allow that member to rejoin. If the member has not rejoined the meeting by the time, members will be treated as having left that meeting. Members are reminded that decisions should be based on consideration of all the contributors to debate, and absence at the meeting may mean that that member should not vote. And finally, if the chairman is made aware that the meeting is not accessible to the public through remote means due to any technological or other failure of provision, the chairman shall adjourn the meeting immediately for 5 minutes to allow for reconnection. If the provision of access through remote means cannot be restored within a reasonable period, then the remaining business will be considered at a time and date fixed by the chairman. If he or she does not fix a date, the remaining business will be considered at the next ordinary meeting. Right, we now move on to the order of proceedings for today. Firstly, can I please ask all members of the forum to confirm their presence once their name is called? So I will call you all out. If you could switch on your microphone and tell me that you're here. And I'd like to start first with Joanne Noble.
Yes, here, Katrina.
Thank you. Anthony Stevens. No. Martin Kyle.
Yeah, here.
Ian Randall.
Yeah, here.
Thank you. Catherine Stratton.
Here. Yeah.
Thank you. Michelle Anderson.
Yes, here, Katrina.
Thank you. Rachel Barrett.
Yes, I'm here.
David Bennett. No. Professor Ken Durans.
Present, Katrina.
Thank you. Mark Woods.
Hello. Here.
Thank you. Thank you. Gavin Booth.
Yeah, here.
Katie Gravel.
Hello, yeah, here.
Thank you. Simon Morley.
Afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Josh Greaves.
Hi, Katrina.
Hi. Helen Stokes.
Hi, I'm here.
Thank you. Julia Merivale.
Yeah, I'm here, Katrina.
Thank you. Paul Thompson.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Martin Shelton.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, can I just go back to see whether Anthony Stevens is in?
Yes, should be here.
He's here. Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you very much. Okay. Right, I'd just like to advise you that we have the following officers present for today's meeting. We have Mark Popwell, Head of Finance Children's Services. We have Elizabeth Bowes, Strategic Finance Manager, Schools Finance Team. We have Martin Smith, Interim Assistant Director of Education. Tony Warnock, Operations and Financial Advice Manager. Sheridan Dodsworth, Children's Services Manager, Special Educational Needs and Disabilities. Michelle Andrews, Children's Services Manager, Early Years. Teresa Rosen, Finance Team Manager. Nicholas Harrison, Democratic Service Officer, and obviously myself, Katrina Coates, Senior Democratic Service Officer. Can I please confirm, is there anyone in attendance who I haven't called their name? Okay, thank you very much. Right, we now need to move on to agenda item number 1. Now, before we move on to this item, I would just like to go through how we're going to actually conduct, how sort of voting is going to continue through the meeting. So I would just like to highlight that to ensure the populace will collate those responses. If you want to vote against, you need to type against in the chat function. And again, Nicholas will pick those up. And then in the absence of any votes against, it will be declared, the motion will be declared as carried. Now, if we do have any votes against, I will then have to conduct a roll call. What I will like to say, though, for agenda item 8, this will be dealt with by roll call. This is to ensure that there's clarity, because that is only for primary maintained representatives only to vote. Are you all in agreement of this course of action? Does anyone dissent?
Yes. Gavin Booth.
Gavin,
Yeah, I'm happy to stand again if that's okay.
do we have a proposer for that? So Simon would like to propose Gavin Booth. Do we have a seconder for that?
Yes, Josh.
So we have a proposer then for Gavin Booth and a seconder for that. Do we have any other nominations? No. So, right then. So we now go into the vote. So with the proposition is then that we have Gavin as chairman for Lincolnshire Schools Forum for 2021. Right. Can I please ask members, is there anybody that wishing to abstain from the vote? Please indicate in the chat now. Has anyone indicated, Nick?
No.
Thank you. Can I then ask members, is there any member that wishes to vote against that proposal? Anyone indicated, Nick?
No.
Thank you. So in the absence of any votes against the proposition, it is carried then. Gavin Booth will be elected chairman of the Lincolnshire Schools Forum for 2021. So it's over to you then, Gavin, if you'd like to take the chair.
Thank you very much, everybody. That's very kind of you, especially in this new technological world, chairing the first forum, I think, via this medium. So it's going to be exciting. So we do need a vice chair as the next item on the agenda. So is there anybody that would be prepared to step forward as a vice chair for Schools Forum for this next year, please? Don't all rush at once. Right, I can see in the chat, Nick, is that Josh is happy to stand?
Yes, Josh Greaves.
So if I'm happy to propose Josh as vice chair for this year. Is anybody prepared to second Josh for that role? And I can see that's a second from Ian Randall.
Yes.
So are there any members that wish to abstain from this vote for Josh to become vice chair of the forum? If you'd indicate abstain in the chat for me. Right, can't see anybody popping up there. Anybody wishing to vote against that as proposition? I can't see anyone, Nick, can you?
No.
No, in that case, in the absence of any votes against, that will be carried and Josh will take on the role of vice chair. Thank you very much, Josh, for this year. Right, if we're happy then, well done, Josh, thank you. We will then move on to item 3 on the agenda, which is apologies for absence / replacement members. Trina, have we got any apologies for today, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, we've just received one apology from Penny Davis, Parent Governor.
Okay, thank you. That moves on to item 4, which is declarations of members' interest. Do members have any interest they wish to declare? If so, can you type speak in the chat function for me? I'm trying to pause long enough to give people to type, but not so long that you're sat there twiddling your thumbs. So I think we're okay that there are no declarations of interest for today. So we'll move on then to item 5, which are the minutes of the Lincolnshire Schools Forum meeting held on the 16th of January. So the question is, do you accept the minutes of the forum from the previous meeting held on the 16th? I'd like to propose them as a correct record. I don't intend on going through them page by page like we would normally do. I think that'd be quite painful through this medium. So I propose them as an accurate thing. Is anybody going to second that?
We've got Martin Kyle who'd like to speak.
All right, Martin, have you got a comment?
Just a comment on trying to think about what we have scheduled in these meetings, and one of them for the January meeting is all about sector-led improvement, but I can't remember that being in the schedule or a record of it in the minutes, but I could have missed it. And the reason I mention that is because I'm just thinking about some of the changes, because on the Schools Forum, you guys have elected me to represent you on the LLPB. There's been a significant amount of changes going on in that, and because COVID and whatever else, there's not been a chance to give a verbal update. So I wondered whether or not there'd be an opportunity, perhaps at the end of today's meeting or not, Chair, for a brief update on what's going on currently at the LLPB.
I know we've definitely got it in for the January meeting, haven't we?
Yeah.
There's an opportunity for that. Trina, where do we stand with regard to things like that in terms of any other business?
We can actually, that can be discussed when we look at the although we've got an item on the agenda to look at the forward plan, we can look at it then, we can raise it then, because it looks like, as you say, it's on the January meeting, so we can discuss it then,
okay.
Gavin.
So if you want to prepare yourself then, Martin, to kind of do that under item 13, that would be great. Thank you very much. So going back to that, everyone happy that I propose those as a correct version of the minutes? Is there anybody prepared to second that for me? So that's Michelle Anderson, happy to second. So it's therefore proposed and seconded that the minutes of the 16th of January be agreed. Again, we have to go through the voting process. So anybody wanting to abstain from the vote, can you please indicate so? Right, anybody against accepting these minutes? Okay, so we'll accept those as a true and accurate record of the last meeting. Thank you very much. Moving on to item 6, which is Chairman's announcements. I'd just like to welcome Paul Thompson, Deputy Director of Education at the Diocese, as the representative of faith groups. So welcome, Paul. Nice to have you here.
Thank you, Gavin.
And then just to make you aware that there are currently 9 vacancies on the Schools Forum, and elections for those vacancies will be held in due course. So as always at this time, once those elections go out, please do encourage friends, colleagues, not relatives, well maybe relatives, to put themselves forward for election, because it's very important that we get a full representation or as close to as we possibly can. Right, moving on to item 7. So this is the National Funding Formula for Schools update for 21-22. This item is on pages 17 to 26 of your pack. We're going to invite Lizzie Bowes, Strategic Finance Manager from the Schools Finance team, to present this report. So over to you, Lizzie.
Thanks, Gavin. Good afternoon, everybody. So the purpose of this report is to provide a summary of the updates from the Department of Education relating to the National Funding Formula for schools, central school services, high needs and early years blocks for 21-22. Page 17 provides some background to the implementation of the National Funding Formula. You will recall this was first introduced in 2018-19. Although local authorities continue to be responsible for calculating schools' funding allocations, they were strongly encouraged to move towards the National Funding Formula so that schools' allocations move towards the full formula. The local authority has been able to replicate the formula since its introduction, which has been positive for Lincolnshire schools and academies. At the end of August 2019, the Prime Minister announced additional investment in the education sector of over £14 billion over the next few years, and the amount per year is detailed towards the bottom of page 17. As a move towards the hard formula, in 2021, the DfE introduced the minimum per pupil factor to ensure that all schools received a minimum level of funding. Additionally, they removed the ceiling cap so that schools will attract their full allocations under the formula. Moving on to page 18, on the 20th of July this year, the government announced the school's revenue funding operational guidance and the provisional dedicated schools grant allocations for 21-22. The DSG will continue to comprise of 4 blocks: the schools block, central school services block, high needs block and early years block. Provisional allocations for 21-22 are detailed in the table in the middle of page 18, and you'll see that at the moment we do not have the provisional allocations for the early years block. So we'll look at each of these blocks separately, starting with the schools block. As a reminder, schools block allocations are calculated by aggregating schools' notional allocations under the national funding formula. There's a separate rate for the primary and secondary sector. In the primary sector, Lincolnshire's position has improved from a national context, but the rates for both the primary and secondary sector are still below the England national average as a result of the indices being used, which is illustrated in the tables. Also at the bottom of page 18 is the link to the operational guide for 21-22. The guidance states that there are two technical adjustments for 21-22. Firstly, funding for the Teachers' Pay Grant and Teachers' Pension Employee Contribution Grant, including supplementary funding, that were previously separate grants outside of the National Funding Formula, will be incorporated into the National Funding Formula for 21-22. The funding has been added to the basic per pupil amount, to the minimum per pupil funding levels, and to the school's 2021 funding baselines so that it is protected through the funding floor. Secondly, information that is used to calculate the income deprivation affecting children index has been updated to include the latest data. The local authority is not required to consult with schools on these two technical changes. We do, however, believe that schools will be required to meet the pay award for September 2020, which will impact the 21-22 financial year. From the overall funding they receive in 21-22, there will be no specific additional funding to finance these costs. Pages 19 and 20 detail the changes to the formula for 21-22. Some of these key changes include local authorities continuing to set the local formula. Schools' funding through the formula will increase by about 4% overall, and key formula factors will increase by 3%. The minimum per pupil funding levels will be set at $4,180 for the primary sector, currently it's $3,750, and $5,415 for secondary schools, currently £4,800. However, it should be noted that within these values, it includes the incorporation of teachers' pay and teachers' pension grant. Every school will attract at least 2% more pupil-led funding per pupil compared to their 2021 baselines. So this means that every school will attract an increase in their pupil-led funding of at least 2% per pupil if the formula is replicated, and the replication will be subject to affordability. Local authorities will continue to set the minimum funding guarantee between plus 0.5% and plus 2%, and again there'll be no ceilings cap. Additional funding will be made available for the small and remote primary schools through an increase in the sparsity factor value. Schools will be able to attract up to £45,000 and currently it's £26,000. This is the first step towards expanding the support the formula provides for small and remote schools following an announcement that this was to be viewed at a national level. And then finally, in relation to rates funding, you recall that this funding is based on the school's actual rate bills from the prior financial year. Previously, the local authority has agreed to undertake a rates funding adjustment in year to ensure schools are funded at the actual rate costs they incur in the financial year. This is the final year of this adjustment, as there has been no agreement to finance this from the DSU underspend in future years. And Appendix A provides a funding comparison of the formula factors from 2021 to 22-23. Moving on to the Central School Services block, the funding that the local authority receives is to cover the central functions the local authority carries out on behalf of all schools and academies and consists of ongoing responsibilities and historic commitments. In relation to the ongoing responsibilities, the per pupil rate is detailed on page 20. The concern continues to be around the historic commitments element of funding. The local authority was surprised when this element of funding was reduced by 20% in 1920. Officers challenged this reduction of the DFE due to the long-term contracts that still remain in place. Unfortunately, officers were not successful, and the government has announced a reduction of a further 20% in 21-22. Officers will continue to raise concerns with the department regarding this cut due to the long-term contracts still remaining in place for the PFI schools until 2032 and the broadband contract until October 22. Moving on to the high needs block, the provisional allocation for 21-22 shows that we anticipate the high needs block of funding increasing by just over £9.5 million to just under £102.5 million. However, again, it should be noted that this increase also includes the incorporation of the teachers' pay and teachers' pension grant under the same principle as the schools block. There continues to be a funding floor so that each local authority sees an increase per head of population of at least 8%. In order to ensure Lincolnshire receives this 8% uplift, we will receive uplift funding of just over £2 million. Hospital funding will also increase by 8% in line with the funding floor. And although the increased funding in the high needs block is welcomed, with the current trajectory of spend and forecast high need block overspend and the uncertainty of future years' high needs block allocations beyond 21-22, there is still an urgent need for transformation in the SEND arena and the support from the school sector. Finally, in terms of the early years block, as I've already mentioned, we are yet to receive the provisional allocation for 21-22. The DfE have confirmed, though, that local authorities' autumn term 2020 funding will be based on the January 20 information rather than January 21, which will provide financial certainty for settings and the local authority during this current year. The local authority has been advised to allocate funding to providers as they would have done had the pandemic not occurred. Since writing the report, the department have confirmed that supplementary funding for maintained nursery schools will continue for the entire 2021 academic year. They have stated that the government is committed to the long-term funding of maintained nursery schools, and any reform to the way they are funded in the future will be accompanied by appropriate funding protection. In terms of pupil premium, this will continue in 21-22, but the rates have not yet been published. Towards the bottom of page 21, there's some information regarding latest advice regarding DSG deficit balances, including the DSG management plan for those local authorities who incur a substantial in-year overspend or have a cumulative DSG deficit at the end of the financial year. So in terms of conclusions at the top of page 22, then clearly the funding announcements are positive news for Lincolnshire schools. However, there is still a large level of uncertainty at a national level due to a number of factors, including COVID-19 and Brexit. It is hoped that the incorporation of the Teachers' Pay and Teachers' Pension Grant into the national funding formula will simplify schools' funding. The area of greatest concern continues to be the high needs block, which Mark will discuss in more detail in a later report, and will continue to require careful management. So in terms of the next steps for local authority, a draft version of the APT that allows officers to undertake modelling of schools' budgets has been released. Officers are currently using the tool to undertake financial modelling to fully understand the impact of the funding announcements detailed in this paper. An issue has been raised with the DfE regarding free school meals. Due to the pandemic, the local authority has seen an increase of 38% in terms of those children who are eligible for a free school meal. The funding the local authority receives within the schools block is based on the pupil characteristics from the previous year's census, so October 2019. Through this approach, the level of funding the local authority is due to receive for free school meals will be understated and therefore could impact the overall affordability of the schools block and could prevent the local authority from being able to replicate the national funding formula in full. But the department has agreed to keep this under review. As in previous years, the local authority is required to engage in open and transparent consultation with all schools and academies regarding the changes identified within the schools block. The consultation will be launched in the autumn term to all Lincolnshire maintained schools and academies. Following the consultation, the findings will then be taken to the local authority's decision-making process. We would ask forum members to encourage their schools and academies to respond to the consultation once it has been published, as response rates in previous years have not been as high as we would like. A final version of the APT will be released in December 2020. This tool will be used to calculate school budget shares for 21-22. The APT will be submitted back to the ESFA by 21st of January 21 for compliance. School budget shares must be published by 28th of February 2021. The government have confirmed they will start to consider the move to a hard formula for 24-25, and a local authority will respond to any proposed amendments to the formula. And finally, we are also conducting a review of targeted SEN funding. The local authority has seen a significant increase in the terms of spend and the number of schools receiving targeted SEN funding. This element of funding was created to provide support to certain schools who had a disproportionate number of pupils with more complex needs. Officers are currently modelling different approaches in terms of how targeted SEN funding could be adapted in the future. If a new approach is agreed, then officers will look to provide a degree of protection for those schools who will lose out financially under the new methodology. And the forum is asked to note the content of the report.
Right, thank you very much, Lizzie. If you'd like to ask Lizzie a question, can you please indicate by saying speak in the chat function? I can see that Tony has a question. Tony, do you want to ask Lizzie your question first, please?
Good afternoon, Lizzie. My question revolves around how are governing boards going to maintain their financial planning based upon the big unknowns now that are put in of teachers' pay and pensions, which are going to come under a fair amount of pressure because of the COVID pandemic, and also the extra funding that all schools are having to find and not currently been supported by government money in actually getting us through week to week with our COVID planning. It's the extra funding that's going out in staffing and cleaning costs that aren't being recompensed through any government means.
Thank you, Tony. What we would first advise is that schools and academies should undertake scenario planning in terms of more than one version of their budget tool to try to estimate those additional costs in terms of the COVID-19 and the pay and pension grant. I think absolutely we recognise that there are additional costs that schools are incurring through all the cleaning, all the staffing. Myself and Mark attended a ESFA webinar with the DfE probably about a month ago with lots of other local authorities, particularly looking at the COVID-19 grant. And the DfE were absolutely adamant that there were certain things that schools could apply for from that summer window, but other things for the autumn term, like the cleaning costs, additional teaching supply costs, they would not be funded. They just expect schools and academies to manage that. Now, that is obviously far from ideal. I think a lot of local authorities are trying to campaign for that to be being unfair, but that's the position we are in at the moment. So what we would advise is that say that you have your your base budget, and then you put another one in with those COVID costs, with those teachers' pension and pay awards, and again possibly looking at different scenarios in terms of different amounts for those for different years to kind of see what the financial impact is on them, but recognise that there are those pressures in the system.
Great, thank you. I think we've got a further question from Joe as well. Joe.
Yes, so the September 2020's Teachers' Pay Award will come from the 21-22 increased funding for schools, but nursery schools aren't due to have any increase. So will we just have to, will it just have to come out of existing budgets for us?
Thanks, Joe. Again, we attended a separate webinar about 2 or 3 weeks ago regarding the APT and National Funding Formula, and one of the questions that was raised at that was for nursery schools, as they are funded through the early years block, what was happening regarding their teachers' pay and teachers' pension grant for those schools, and we're still waiting for clarification. So I'm afraid I don't know at this moment in time, but it's on our radar to try and find out for you.
Okay, thank you.
Mark, do you want to come in there?
Thanks, Gavin. Yeah, in sort of picking up Joe's point, so obviously that government grant monies is going to nursery schools presently. So really the expectation is that money will be added to the early years block. Otherwise, it would be a cost reduction for nursery schools. So one is expecting that will be added to the early years block. In terms of the announcement of future funding for nursery schools, it is obviously it's still to be reviewed. It's something that we are certainly sort of campaigning for to ensure that it does provide that longer term financial stability, and also knowing where you fit within that sort of national agenda in terms of early years support. So that's something that we're continuing to raise. And then just adding to Lizzie's point in terms of ponies, there has been a government review looking at in terms of affordability for mainstream schools on the teachers' pay and pension. Obviously, Lizzie's articulated about the existing funding going out to schools being mainstreamed within your delegated budgets. But what they're saying is, as part of the funding announcement and the 3% increase, those formula factors, enough money should be in the system to meet that cost for September 2020 and going forward. What we would expect, though, is an annual review to be taking place, and actually the government to be ensuring that actually when decisions are made from the sort of the low pay commissioner and other bodies, that actually the formula is reflective of that. It's actually keeping up pace with actually those announcements. They obviously did that as a response to the teachers' pay and pension. obviously that large pension increase, but what we would expect that to become as business as usual, a part of the funding settlement. But it's something to review, and I think, like Lizzie said, that scenario planning in future years is really important, because obviously the funding settlement for schools is at the moment only a 1-year funding settlement. Thank you.
Great. Can we just go to Josh for a question then, please?
Thank you, Chair. It's of course it's very welcome that not only is there an uplift in the minimum funding for mainstream schools, but that was announced in summer to allow everyone to plan looking forward. My question's around the high needs block specifically, and again, whilst it's welcome that there's an 8% uplift in the high needs block in its totality, my question is, alternative provision and special settings only have the protection of a 0% minimum funding guarantee, so they're guaranteed nothing, whereas mainstream schools obviously have a positive funding floor. So does the authority, do officers propose to suggest for consultation a positive minimum funding guarantee for special and alternative schools, or not, to mirror the entitlement for mainstream pupils?
Yeah, happy to come in here, Josh. So in terms of the preparation work that we'll be undertaking in high needs, obviously the funding announcement was welcomed, but as you'll be obviously appreciating, and obviously what's been said in sort of prior papers that we'll be looking at, and obviously the position from last year, we will need to consider it in the round in terms of looking at all those funding commitments, looking at those trajectories going forward. And clearly, if there is flexibility within the system, we would be looking to try and support schools with those increasing costs. So that would be something that we'll be going through. And yes, you're correct that we will be undertaking a consultation exercise within the special school sector, and obviously picking up in terms of alternative provision within that as well. So yes, that will be a review that we'll be looking to undertake and obviously implement from April 21. But what we'll be looking to do, obviously, affordability is absolutely critical at this challenging time, and we obviously obviously managing the increase in demands that we're facing for more specialist support for children, not only in mainstream but also the demand for special school places. So that will be something that we'll be looking to consider. Obviously, the guidance that's been stipulated is obviously a 0% MFG. But what we'll do is we'll look to try and support schools, including the special schools and alternative provision, as best as we can. But obviously I can't provide what that position is at the moment, but we'll be looking to work through that in the autumn, and then to consult with colleagues such as yourself. Thank you.
Great. So anybody else got any questions for Lizzie? We're just asked to note the contents of this report, so if there aren't any further questions, we'll say thank you very much and move on. I don't think so. Right, thank you, Lizzie. Right, we're moving on now to item 8, which is the de-delegation of maintained primary schools budgets for 21-22 and 22-23, which is in pages 27 to 36 of the pack. Mark is the head of finance for Children's Services, is going to present that for us. Again, just remind people that this is an item that we'll need to vote on at the end via a roll call, and that is for primary maintained representatives only, I believe. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Gavin. Yes, so obviously the purpose of this paper is to seek approval from the maintained primary school representatives to the local authority's proposal for the de-delegation of certain budgets for 21-22 and 22-23. So just as a bit of a background, starting on page 27, so the government's decision to implement the national funding formula still allows the de-delegation of certain budgets for our maintained schools. And that is defined, those eligible budgets and services are defined by the Department for Education. So key features of this is that only maintained primary and maintained secondary schools, mainstream schools can fund de-delegations as part of their budget shares, and therefore academies are not affected by this paper. So the decision to de-delegate funds has to be based on a sector vote. So whether that's the primary or the secondary. The budgets do flex during the year as academy conversions do take place. So that will be something that have to manage. And any underspends or indeed overspends relating to those delegation budgets would form part of an earmarked reserve, and they would be retained for the purpose of set out as part of the dedelegations. So moving on to page 28. So this is just really reflecting on the 2019-20 financial year. So in terms of the primary maintained school dedelegation funds, there were two categories that we had budgets for. So the first one was within the category of contingency. So those budgets held related to the termination of employment costs, and that is a budget that supports those schools in financial difficulties, and it's a process managed through the staffing reduction panel with sort of key professionals across the county council supporting schools to ensure that they can set sustainable financial models going forward. And also within that, we have the exceptional unforeseen costs, which relate to the interim head teachers support, and also the intervention funding to support sort of rapid recovery of schools. We also then have the ethnic minority and traveller education team that is also supported by the dedelegation in the prior year. No funds were dedelegated for maintained secondary schools, and that's largely down to the large proportion of secondaries that are actually academies. So actually the pool of resource wouldn't be achieved within that sector. So reflecting on what the actual overall financial position is, so within the actual reserves that we held for March 2020, there was an amount of 572,000 that was brought forward figure from prior years, and also from the 2019. Included within this, we've got a sum of 260,000, and that relates to a one-off scholar advisor support fund that was previously agreed a couple of years ago. The local authority haven't needed to draw that down. We've been able to manage that additional cost within county council funding, but also within the interim heads budget from the prior year. So that allows for additional school improvement activity to take place for our maintained schools. So taking that away, the dedelegation balance that we have to manage a number of variables is 312,000. And the section there in sort of the middle of page 28, it details all of those variables. And I think just drawing out a couple of those, it is obviously the academy status. We do have a movement of maintained schools in academies. It is much slower now, but it is still taking place. And therefore, that then reduces the budget envelope that the support services have to support those maintained schools. And obviously, the actual number of schools in financial difficulties, that can vary based on their individual circumstances, whether that's their number on roll or pupil characteristics. So therefore, that's something that the budgets have to be responsive for to support them. And indeed, also for those in difficulties from a school improvement performance. And therefore, the local authority have to respond and through this sort of demand-led nature. So moving on to the dedelegation position for 2021 that was agreed by the Schools Forum in October 2019. It details there the contingency amount of £29.23 and also the MTET amount per pupil of £6.01. And just to confirm, they were the rates that we used in 2019-20. There was actually no change that we made to the rates. And it also details in the middle of page 28 those budgets that actually those per pupil amounts actually finance. And what we've got in Appendix 1, which is page 31 of the book, of your pack, sorry, details obviously the purpose of what they are, how the monies are spent, and then the outcomes. And hopefully that gives you a good understanding how the monies are being deployed to best effect. So I'd just like to draw to you page 33 and just sort of show you some of the impact that actually has. So this is the Primary Maintained Intervention Fund. And within the 2019 analysis, it identified we actually supported 67 different schools for specific issues. And that was really drawn from sort of the local intelligence, whether that's the locality teams or interim heads, or even indeed sort of strategy meetings. And actually, what's following that investment, and I think that just shows you in terms of the deployment of that, is that actually now what we're seeing of those 67 schools, 38 of them are now actually rated green as part of the reg rating system. 26 of those have moved from vulnerable from high risk, and then we've got the remaining 3 that still remain as sort of high risk. But hopefully that sort of demonstrates sort of the investment that's been made. And the reason why it's there is that these schools wouldn't have the financial capacity to actually use existing budgets to meet that. So it actually enables sort of rapid sort of improvements to take place to enable these schools to recover and to support pupils within the school. So referring back to page 28, in terms of the proposals for 21-22 and 22-23. So in terms of those the delegation budgets termed contingency, the local authorities proposing that for 21-22, those same per pupil rates will apply as 2021, so they will remain as what we've had for the prior 2 years. And the actual budgets will be determined by the October 2020 census. So obviously, once that information comes, we would then establish budgets based on that, and then we'll work within those parameters. And the reserves will also enable us to support if there's a certain responsive action that we need to do beyond what actually the current budgets are. But clearly, we will need to flex those budgets if the actual number on roll for maintained schools did reduce. And in terms of the MTEP budget, that is made up of staffing, and the proposal for 21-22 is actually that requires a fixed budget, albeit it will be reviewed on an annual basis to ensure that actually it's representative of the maintained schools that it supports, but also the English as the additional language pupils it supports as part of that overall cohort. But actually, that's a slight difference in terms of the contingency budgets where we're actually wanting to retain a fixed budget for that for 21-22. But moving on to page 29, the proposed per pupil rates are identified at the top of the page. And obviously, the MTEP budget is obviously a provisional amount, but it shouldn't be too significant from that, because obviously it'll be based on the actual October census. So that is the position that we're proposing for 21-22. And also what we're also seeking as part of this is in principle support from maintained primary school members regarding the actual 22-23 position as well, just to provide some form of stability for the schools that actually this is something that the actual sector continues to support. So in terms of next outcomes, subject to the decision being made this afternoon, these will then be reflected as part of the maintained primary school future budgets from 21-22 and as part of their delegated budgets. And also, I think it's worth pointing out that actually the local authorities continue the reviewing the output of these budgets, and also about how we support our sort of most vulnerable maintained primary schools. So in consultation, in conclusion, a decision is therefore being sought from our maintained primary schools for the delegation budgets for 21-22 and in principle for 22-23. Thank you, Gavin.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Has anybody got any questions that they'd like to ask Mark about that before we look at proposing and seconding it going forward? No, can't see anybody popping up. So, because this is obviously for primary maintained schools only, what we do need is it to be proposed and seconded from those members. And then we'll need to have a vote on it, which will have to be a roll call, I'm afraid. So do we have anybody from the primary members that are prepared to propose that? That's proposed by Tony, I can see in the chat. And then we need someone to second it. Second by Ian Randall, thank you very much. and then we need to do a formal vote. So can I hand over to you, Trina, to do the roll call, please? So that's for the primary maintained schools representatives on the Schools Forum to agree the proposals for de-delegation of the budgets for the period 21-22 and 22-23 in principle as set out in the report. So over to you, Trina.
Thank you, Chairman. So if you can say whether you're for, against or abstain. So Anthony Stevens.
For.
Martin Kyle.
For.
Ian Randall.
For.
And Catherine Stratton.
For.
That's unanimous then, Chairman.
Thanks very much. For a minute there, I thought it was my votes for Strictly Come Dancing. Falls across the board. Right, move. Thank you. Moving on then to item number 9, the revised school budgets 2020-2021. This is in pages 37 to 48 of the report pack, and again, it's another report presented by Mark. Over to you, Mark, for this one.
Thanks, Gavin. So the purpose of this report is to notify the Schools Forum of the revised school budget for 2021 and to seek support for the proposed use of the DSG underspend from 1920. So starting on the background, you'll be aware, obviously, the dedicated schools grant, the DSG, is a ring-fence grant that can only be spent for the purposes outlined within the Department for Education regulations. So a revision of the school budgets is required every year to reflect the under and overspends relating to prior year's activities, and also in the early years block. Under the Department for Education regulations, underspends are automatically carried forward to the following financial year. There has been a number of changes made by central government relating to the management of the dedicated schools grant. And just to draw your attention to the new provisions in those regulations, which require local authorities with overspends, their dedicated schools grants, carry them forward, be dealt with in the new and future financial years. This is actually in response to the overall position on local authorities' dedicated schools grants. And some of those local authorities with quite meaningful overspends, as I've previously discussed at forums. So what the government have put in parameters regarding how this is managed, and actually what they're identifying is that we would have to seek Secretary of State approval to disregard this requirement, in essence, to actually fund this from another funding source other than the dedicated schools grant. So that we would need actual special authorisation by the Secretary of State to do that. Therefore, the pressures would therefore need to be found within the actual dedicated schools grant itself. And I think just to reflect in terms of the overall council's financial position and the financial pressures that is facing, impacted with obviously COVID-19 as well. And so therefore the council is obviously in a sort of a challenging position and in terms of managing its own finances, as well as obviously trying to manage the dedicated schools grant, which obviously is nationally is under significant challenge. So in terms of the carry forward to 1920, the overall underspend brought forward for the dedicated schools grant at the end of March 2020 was 12.6 million. Before accounting for existing commitments, which have been brought to the Schools Forum before, of 7.3 million, therefore leaving an available balance of 5.3 million, or 0.89% of Lincolnshire's overall dedicated schools grant. And this reflects the overall net underspend on the dedicated schools grant of 64,000 in 1920. So detailed within Appendix A, which is page 43 of your pack, those detailed, those material variances to draw your attention to. So if I could move to page 43 to draw out some of those. So I think the most prominent area, to draw your attention to is the high needs block and the material overspend that took place at 2.4 million. So this area has been impacted due to obviously growth in the pupils requiring more specialist support, not only in mainstream provision, so those requiring an education healthcare plan in mainstream schools and colleges, but also the need for more specialist places within Lincolnshire. So that means sort of the special school sector. But actually, due to the capacity demands in that area, we're then having to place more children out of local authority provision. So table, so if on page 43 in the second table of the high needs block, you'll see there some of the material overspend within the high needs top-up arrangements within mainstream schools, colleges, and also in the outer county area. We were fortunate in last year to have an alternative provision place funding payment by the Department for Education due to the new free schools opening. So that provided a temporary underspend for 1920 to offset those overspends. And ordinarily, if that hadn't have taken place, the overspend would have been much greater. There are other areas of under and overspends within there, but the high needs area was the area to draw to your attention. So reverting back to the actual main content of the report, moving on to existing commitments. So a thorough review of existing commitments have taken place, and prudent estimates have been determined. Those were to the value of 7.3. Those are detailed in Appendix B, which is starting on page 46. Again, sorry to then just move you on to page 46. I mean, you'll be familiar with a lot of these commitments because obviously these were commitments that have papers, supporting papers that have brought to prior Schools Forum meetings. Just drawing your attention to a couple of those. So spending has been taking place for the early years rate increase. So you'll remember in January of this year, the proposal to increase the hourly rate by 12p temporarily to support improvements in outcomes as a comparison to our overall sort of reduction in performance. So that money is obviously being allocated out to the sector. And also spending commitments are starting to take place within the SEND strategy. So you'll remember the £2 million earmarked, the revenue support for the overall special schools capital programme. And this is about establishing all need provision and also increasing the number of places for Lincolnshire, but for Lincolnshire pupils to be placed for that extra support. In two other areas, just to draw your attention to, is the sector-led model, which sort of Martin touched on earlier, and also the former two-year-old sufficiency funding in the early years sector. I think it's worth noting on those two areas is that actually monies and spending has been paused to a degree whilst we evaluate the impact, obviously, of the coronavirus that has had on those sectors, the national that's being rolled out, and then it's then reflecting, working with the local authority and partners on what needs to be addressed locally to support our recovery. So they're two areas that are being paused and to help and us understand what we need to do to actually support the sector in this recovery phase. So moving back to page 38 of the main paper. So proposed developments, the local authority is not proposing any future developments. So in terms of the proposals for the uncommitted sum, which is 5.3 million, the LA is proposing that the remaining sum is not committed and is held in reserves. And it's largely down to the current spending levels and trajectories in the special education needs area, but also about the uncertainty of the financial environment going forward, of which the remaining paper sort of draws those points out. So I think it's worth just drawing out, obviously, the significant economic uncertainty due to COVID-19, which has led to the government's postponement of the autumn budget, which would have obviously involved a commitment in terms of sort of future year spending for different departments, of which it would have been set for the school sector. The main risk for most local authorities, or indeed all local authorities, and Lincolnshire, is the high needs block arena. Just to draw to your attention is that there has been a number of government reviews back in 2019 for how for the support arrangements for children with SEND And also there was the call for evidence, which looked at the SEND fund generally. Unfortunately, those outcomes have been delayed until next year, which obviously was disappointing, and clearly local authorities crying out for solutions and to see how we can support children, and also within the actual financial parameters that the government funding has provided us. But a promise of overall high needs funding has been made, but it won't be until sort of within the next 4 years. And obviously that will then take account of all of those outcomes from the reviews. So the local authority, moving on to page 39, so the local authority will obviously be continuing to operate with the same legislative and financial framework until that point. So in terms of just giving some context in terms of Lincolnshire sort of high needs demands, at January 2020, the number of EHCs, we've seen a 10% increase from the prior year. And actually nationally, we are above the national average at 3.3 compared to 3.1 of the number of EHCs within the county. And now we've been having more, we're maintaining 55% more statutory plans than we did before the SEND reform. So quite a significant change in the landscape within the high needs area. So we've been doing a piece of work at the moment, trying to forecast sort of future trajectories. Obviously, it's subject to many variables, but from a high level perspective, what we're seeing here is actually that if the continued trajectories take place, from a financial perspective, the high needs block is unsustainable at this level. And clearly, even allowing for the government's investments that are taking place is certainly putting significant pressure on local authorities in terms of ensuring a balanced budget, particularly when the government are putting various steps in place for local authorities to ensure that those budgets, those spending are kept within those budgets established. So this is something that we'll be certainly considering as part of our transformational work. So drawing on the Appendix A, showing the overall high needs overspend, I think it's a useful reminder in terms of some of those budgets within the high needs area are significant, they are very large, demand-led, and can be difficult to estimate. So it is something just to bear in mind when the local authority is trying to manage that. But this is certainly having a material impact in terms of our overall position. I mean, Sheridan will pick out from her report the main activities regarding the transformational work. But I think it's just worth just drawing out that work is being going on with partners, and obviously the school sector will be heavily part of this. And a document is being produced in terms of the Lincolnshire Schools Forum strategy. So that's going to be fundamental to the work and rollout and support that we'll be having with the sector. But what it's trying to do is trying to ensure the improved outcomes for young children with special educational needs through an integrated approach, and also ensuring that is within sort of the financial parameters that we're able to work within from overall government funding. So in terms of the bottom, page 39, and the overall dedicated schools grant position, many local authorities are facing significant financial strain as a result, whether that's significant dedicated schools grant overspends or substantial in-year changes in their overall spending. And the government's requirement in response to this is that we for those local authorities concerned, would need to complete a DFE ESG management plan, setting out how they were looking to recover that overall financial position. At the top of page 40, what is really helpful again drawing out is actually some of the actual financial impact and the scale of the issue that nationally local authorities are facing. So for over half of local authorities are experiencing a dedicated schools grant overspend, and that is amounting at the end of 18-19, 150 million, or a net position including underspend such as Lincolnshire that we're holding of an overspend of 40 million. But the actual forecasted position for 1920 for all local authorities was an overspend of 30 million. So it shows you the scale of it, how important the work that the government are doing in terms of, and obviously the outcomes from those reviews, to ensure that local authorities can continue supporting children with special educational needs. So there are other risks also within the blocks, which are detailed in the paper, within the schools block, central school services block, and indeed the early years block. And that's something that the local authority also has to manage to ensure that we deliver on our outcomes, and also our expectations are particularly like the school national funding formula and the prospect of replicating that again, but obviously the challenges of issues that Lizzie rose about, the preschool meals increase and such like. So there's things that as a local authority we're continually trying to manage and obviously represent our views to central government. So in conclusion, an increasing number of local authorities are seeing a deficit on their overall DSGs, and obviously the recent changes from central government in terms of tightening those arrangements through the introduction of further regulations, how those overspends are managed, but also how those positions are recovered. So obviously Lincolnshire is not in that position, although we are seeing rising costs and actually overspends on the actual high needs block itself. We do have available reserves to draw on, which is the 5.3 million. And the key thing from this is obviously this allows us to do sort of thoughtful planning, engage with the sector, and then to embed practices. So it really provides us with time to be able to introduce changes to improve practices, but also ensuring that spending is directed to the right activities to maximise those outcomes for children with special educational needs, whilst also it being financially sustainable. So the local authority is proposing as part of this paper that the remaining sum is not committed due to everything I've explained this afternoon, and that the reserves is then held to manage potentially any anticipated growth in costs in the area of SEND due to the much more challenging financial environment going forward, obviously to allow any of that transformational work to be embedded. Clearly, we do have options outside of the actual high needs block in terms of transferring funding from the schools block, or indeed reviewing some of those preventive services. The local authority feels that that actually that is not something that we would wish to pursue or even look at. And actually, we feel that actually through the transformational work agenda and ensuring that we're able to maintain those reserves, provide us with that time, and then we will work with the school sector to embed some of those plans. But overall, we obviously need to manage during this difficult time the DSG to avoid it overall overspending, and obviously to start embedding some plans and working with the sector on our transformational work. So that's really concluding the report. So it's really seeking the forum's support to retain the overall dedicated schools grant reserves and uncommitted to allow time to respond to sort of this changing environment, and happy to take questions on any sort of commitments or any other thing that you may have from the report. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Mark. Martin Kyle.
Hi, Mark. Just to ask, we mentioned there, we talked about high needs block and things, and we talked about improved outcomes and how there's not improved outcomes or whatever. What's that measure we're using for improved outcomes?
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. Maybe Sheridan can actually step in and maybe answer that. But no, there's obviously a lot of work, and the speed of the work is taking place. And I think it's something that we will be needing to measure. We will need to have, as part of all of this investment, and there will be some investment we'll need to put in, and initially to try and support and facilitate change. But I think you're quite right, Martin, in terms of the assessment of the outcome. As part of any investment, as part of any change that we do, we need to ensure that actually they can be measurable. And actually, that will help us shape whether actually we're going in the right direction as part of some of the potential transformational work, and whether actually we stop, pause, reflect, and then obviously make further decisions. So no, I think you're quite right in terms of having clear measures, objective measures that we can reflect on. Obviously, at the end of the day, this money needs to be maximised to its potential. So no, I agree with your sentiments that it needs to be clearly measured. But I think at this point in time, and Sheridan or Martin may be able to add that we need to start establishing them, and then we need to start to see actually what KPIs we need to be measuring against.
That's right, and there's multifaceted, aren't they? Especially with these high need pupils. I looked at it and I saw how there was overspending high needs top up funding, learner with learning difficulties and disabilities, and out of county placements. And I reflected on it and thought, goodness me, if I've got a child with high needs, I wanted to come to Lincolnshire as a county because they're well catered for. And if they need to do some budget amendments so that the child can be successful, they're willing to do that because everything's about the pupil. Everything we do is about that pupil being successful and the families that we serve. So I looked at it with that angle on, and I thought when we said high needs block unsustainable in the current trajectory, I guess it depends what we value within that, and those are decisions maybe we'll be making as a forum in due course. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, no, that's correct. I mean, in terms of those issues, yeah, we have only got a finite amount of monies, and it will also be about working with the mainstream sector in terms of what measures, in terms of practices, establishing best practice of how they can best support them within existing funding, how we can best utilise all of the outreach arrangements that we have, the behaviour outreach service, the Healthy Minds, how we can draw that and get that support in early to avoid sort of escalation. So there's clearly a whole-scale review that we need to consider to ensure that we are making these investments, but actually are they achieving the maximum potential from that? So yes, it's about, I guess it will be a whole sector review in terms of, and obviously school support is fundamental to this.
Thanks. Another question from Joe Noble.
Yeah, just sort of an observation really. The early years block has had the biggest underspend, and I think as a proportion of the block that of the actual early years block, I think that's a bigger proportion than the schools block is and the central block is, and then that obviously then feeds into it's then a bigger proportion of the higher needs overspend. So it was just a thought really, and I know the higher needs overspend needs to be solved, but I wondered whether more money that would, so an increase in the hourly rate into the early years sector might just help with addressing some of these higher needs earlier in the children's lives. So actually that the higher needs block doesn't overspend in the future.
Thanks, Joe. Yes, I mean, we've been reflecting, obviously each year, each January, we bring to the forum and identify the rate, the hourly rate that we pay providers and obviously nursery schools as well. And yes, we have been experiencing underspends, and obviously we devolved some of that underspend in the current year, which is that commitment of £1 million. But we also actually increased the hourly rate uplift. Obviously, a proportion of that was from central government monies, but also we felt that actually there was flexibilities within that budget, and we felt that obviously it was a requirement to actually release that. So we actually did uplift the rates for this current year as a result of prior underspendings taking place. Although the underspend itself, in terms of percentage terms, for the 3 and 4 year olds, it was only represented about 1.7%. When you reflect on the demand-led nature of it, so it's based on parental sort of number of hours, number of children taking it up, it's a very volatile budget when actually we're only funded at 2 points in the year as a bit of a snapshot. So it is really difficult to manage, and it fluctuates from across each of those terms. So no, in terms of I guess the question there is that yes, we have learned lessons in terms of, obviously we do is a volatile budget, but what we've done is we've reduced some of that prudence and therefore allowed an increase not only to the rate on a permanent basis from 2021, but also we released £1 million in the current years to support schools. And this is something that we'll be reviewing annually, and obviously be tabled in the next forum in January. But no, it is a valid point, and it is something that we're observing and taking note of. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions for Mark before we vote on this one? Okay, so the forum's asked to note the report and to support the local authority's proposals for the use of the uncommitted sum as outlined in section 5 of Mark's report. I'm able to propose the report. Can I have a seconder, please? So second from Rachel, thank you very much. Okay, so we need to vote. Are there any members wishing to abstain from this vote? Please type abstain in the chat for me. No. Any members against this proposition? Please type against. Okay, so in the absence of any votes against the proposition will be carried. Thank you very much. And we move on to item 10, which is the annual report on special educational needs and disabilities, which is on page 49 to 60 in the pack. And Sheridan Dodsworth, Service Manager for Special Educational Needs and Disabilities, will hopefully be here to present the report. Sheridan.
I am here. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So the purpose of the report I'm delivering this afternoon is to provide the forum with an update on SEND activity. You've had an indication of that from some of the previous reports, but to put that into context nationally and then to reflect on our local position. To talk a little bit about the overview of the high needs costs, although Mark has actually gone into a lot of detail about that, and are they actually putting pressures on the high needs budget. To talk through some of the high-level information on the current trajectories, which is arising out of some of the transformation work that we're doing that Mark referred to earlier, and looking at that in relation to the risks that potentially poses around special educational needs activity. And then I want to just touch on a little bit more detail about the transformation programme that we've got currently in Lincolnshire, which some of your schools and many of our partners have been involved in. And then just finally, before I conclude, just to give a bit of an update on the impact of COVID-19, particularly for children and young people with special educational needs. So I think, as I do every year, just set out a reminder of what the Special Educational Needs agenda is about, the introduction of the Children and Families Act in 2014 and a revised code of practice, which I suppose essentially the key thing was that it placed a strong focus on outcomes. And we just talked a couple of minutes ago about outcomes. And helpful points being made about what are we measuring in terms of outcomes, and I will touch on that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. But the code of practice and the new legislation had that strength of focus on outcomes, with a recognition that previously, in the way that we were delivered provision for young people with special needs, we weren't seeing any improvement in their outcomes, and in fact they were often and still are significantly out of line with their peers who don't have additional needs. There was also, as you will all be aware, an extension to the age range for special educational needs. So we're now 0 to 25, which in itself has brought some pressures which are captured in my report. So in terms of the national context, everywhere in the country has seen an increase in the number of children being identified with special educational needs, and a 10% increase in the number of children and young people identified and requiring education, health and care plans. Again, just in light of some of the discussion, I think it's probably important to reflect that the most significant increase in plans nationally and in Lincolnshire as well has been for those aged 5 to 10. Followed closely by those 11 to 15, and then a relatively large number, very close to the 11 to 15, a large percentage increase in children under the age of 5. I think probably just to say now, where we've got the increase in children under 5, and this may tie in with one of the comment that Joe was making, where we see quite a big increase is actually just before they transfer into statutory education. And we then see another leap between year 6 and year 7. And so there seems to be a view that one phase of education can manage these young people, but there's a concern that the next phase won't be able to manage them. And that seems to apply particularly from nursery into statutory school age, and then again from primary into secondary. So I think, again, it's about us understanding some of that and putting that into some sort of context for Lincolnshire. So clearly it's a national issue as well, but obviously I guess our concern is about Lincolnshire in particular. So increase overall in plans nationally, quite a big increase in terms of those over the age of 16, smaller in terms of 20 to 25, and in Lincolnshire we sit just under the national figure for both of those. But that obviously does put a pressure on budgets as well, because we go to that 25-year mark, which in actual fact is the day before the 26th birthday. So it's actually, you know, all the way through the year that they're 25 as well. Just to put into context in terms of education, health and care plans, the school census data used nationally has nationally 3.1% of the school population with an education, health and care plan, and in Lincolnshire we're 3.3%. But in Lincolnshire we're also overall identifying more children with SEN, and therefore obviously inevitably we have more children at SEN support on that sort of graduated approach as well. So the reforms were intended to meet the needs of most children with SEN at that SEN support graduated approach phase. And whilst obviously it's fair to say there are still many, many children in Lincolnshire and nationally that are managed at that SEN support stage, it's the fact that we're increasing the statutory provision that is obviously having the greatest pressure that we see on our budgets, and obviously the knock-on effect of, you know, in needing increasing staffing to manage all of that process, so on and so forth. So just quickly touching on the context in Lincolnshire a little bit more, we look on the face of it to have increased we do a return to the DFE in January, based on a January figure each year, and we look to have increased by about 10% between January 19 and January 20 in terms of the number of young people with education, health and care plans. But for reasons that I will just touch on again in a bit more detail in a moment, we had a delay in completing some of those assessments. So in actual fact, our increase is more like 17%, which actually puts us 7% above the England rate. So we seem to be, we've been doing some other work and presenting at a number of in a number of different arenas, and have a nifty graph that we've been using. And actually what you see when you plot it against the England figure and our East Midlands colleagues, our gap is widening and widening. We seem to be increasing the number of EHC plans. So although there is an increase nationally, we're breaking away from that, and we're seeing a bigger increase than other authorities. I think I present this every year, but just to reiterate again this year, in Lincolnshire, we don't end education, health and care plans other than when children leave school, education or training, or leave the authority. So you can see from the figures I've put in the report, only one child in Lincolnshire over last year had their education, health and care plan ended because the school felt they could meet the needs back at an SEN support graduated approach level. We are at odds with other parts of the country in that regard as well. So what we're seeing are children then with statutory plans for longer and longer and longer, and perhaps seeing outcomes being put into plans that the child then achieves the outcomes, and then a new set of outcomes are put in. And so the plans are going on and on and on. And obviously some of the transformation work we want to do is to be able to look at how do we end those plans for young people and celebrate the success at that point for them. Our number of overall requests for education, health and care plans continues to rise. And over the last year's report, we saw a 35% increase in the number of requests for education, health and care needs assessments. And then rather than, I haven't gone into all the facts and figures, but it's suffice to say, it's probably really important to let you know that we've not only got an increase in education, health and care needs assessment requests, but actually we're saying no to fewer and fewer. It again ties in with some of the transformation work that I want to touch on in a few moments. And it's probably, I've got to say that when we say no to assessment, the threshold for statutory assessment is very low. It is that the child may have special educational needs and may require an educational health and care plan. And actually what we see is the sector supporting families in appealing. So if we do say no because we believe that the child's needs could still be met at SEN support, we often have the sector supporting families in terms of going to appeal. So it feels sometimes like we're at odds with one another, and we don't want to be in that position. What we want is to get the right provision to the right children at the right time, which is some of the work that I'll talk about in a few minutes. I've put our figures in, as I've already alluded to, in terms of our numbers, and you can see that obviously, like England, a large percentage of our new plans were the 5 to 10 year olds, but very closely followed by 11 to 15, and then this large group of young people under the age of 5. Just to say, at the moment, our youngest with an education, health and care plan is 10 months. So, you know, obviously prior to the reforms that would never have been possible. That wasn't possible. So, you know, that big increase, we need to kind of understand that in a little bit more and just, you know, just really begin to unpick why we're seeing so many, what can we do differently, if we can do anything differently, and work together as a partnership to see if we can address some of those issues. Just to touch on the actual sort of figures about where young people are, I think it's important to recognise, Mark's alluded to this already in his report, the increase in the number of children going into special schools. So last year we saw a 4% increase again on the previous year of children going into special schools, and that represents 38% of all of those young people of school age that are in specialist provision. The school census information is quite difficult to work with because actually those figures are based on children of school age, not necessarily the overall cohort of all of those that have got education, health and care plans. But suffice to say, that increase obviously is a challenge at the moment, as Mark has talked through. That also means that we don't have the capacity in our special schools currently, and therefore children are having to go into independent provision, which again is usually much more costly, and you know, I will say not necessarily making any difference to the outcomes for those young people, but costs us a significant amount more in terms of funding. We've then got a further 4% of pupils that are in independent specialist provision that I've just talked about, and then also young people that are in independent schools, so independent mainstream. And then falling at either side of that, you know, just accounting for all the young people, then obviously we have a cohort of young people who are in early years provision, and then obviously a post-16 provision as well. Just very quickly touching on timescales, because it is something I've usually included, and it's important because we have to report on it every year, and we are it's a fairly important indicator for us. Lincolnshire, you know, over the recent years, we've done very well in terms of meeting our timescales. 20 weeks is the timescale that we have to complete an education, health and care needs assessment. We dipped last year. And this tallies with what I said earlier about the numbers of plans that increased last year versus the number of plans that should have been completed last year, which actually makes the increase even greater. We had an issue last year where we had some difficulties accessing educational psychology advice and information, and that meant that we then couldn't progress to complete education, health and care needs assessments, because we are required to seek advice and information for an educational psychologist. I am really pleased to report that situation is now resolved. We have no delay in EP advice and information, and actually reports are being completed. I said here within 4 weeks, but actually many of them are in less than 3 weeks, and EPs have got 6 weeks to complete that report. So actually that backlog that we had is now fully cleared, and we're in a really good position. But that did skew both our figures last year and also the dip that we saw in our timescales. But at the end of September 2020, and it's the same actually today, I've checked, 91% of the current EHC and ED assessments that are going through are still within timescale. So that is positive. In terms of the high needs funding analysis, I think obviously Mark has gone into a lot of detail already, but it's right and proper that it's included here because this is a paper about special educational needs and those pressures on the high needs block. So essentially, you can see the difference over the last 5 years from where we were in terms of the allocated funding. Back in 15-16, it was at 9.6 million. 1920, it's 17.7 million. So significant increase in the funding that's being allocated. And then under that is on page 53 is the special school allocation as well. So we saw, and it was an increase in the allocation between 1920 and 2021 of £1 million. And then when you go to the bottom of page 53, where we've got our independent non-maintained specialist provision and our independent schools which are maintained, but sort of mainstream, but we have a number of children in those as well. Again, you can see that we're set to increase by further 1 million there this year as well. So we're not talking about insubstantial amounts of money here. The increases are significant. If I could just then move on to page 54. And talk about the trajectories. So the trajectories that we've been doing have arisen out of some of the transformation work that we started the back end of last summer, and then undertook sort of more in more detail from the autumn of last year. As if we continue as we are now, we would expect to have by 2023 over 8,000 education, health and care plans. We already now, at September 2020, have over 6,000. In fact, it's actually now over 6,100. And that's an almost 50% increase from where we were in 2014 at the beginning of the reforms. Now, acknowledging that nationally there's been an increase as well, I'm not underplaying that at all. But given that the intention of the reforms was to try to manage children in mainstream settings and as many as possible at SEN support, this feels like it's running away with us. And so some real work needs to sort of take place through the transformation work that we're doing to try to address some of that. Because it added into that, I talked about the 4% increase in the number of children going to special schools. You're aware from reports that I've given previously and Mark spoke about earlier, the Building Communities of Specialist Provision is our special school strategy, which is aimed at creating over 500 new places. But currently, on the trajectories that we've got, those places that we hoped we were future-proofing for at least the foreseeable future up to the next 10 years, we will fill those in next to no time, and we'll be back to where we are. So not only will we have invested in the creation of additional special school places, but actually we'll still then have to rely on the independent sector as well, who, there's no doubt about it, that they can effectively hold us to ransom. And some of those placements that we have are incredibly costly. It's £250,000, £300,000 a year for a child to go to an independent, non-maintained specialist placement. So we really do need to think about that. But more importantly, going back to the point about children's outcomes, it's about us linking the huge investment, both financially and in terms of all the support that schools provide, that our special services provide, our early help services provide. What we're not seeing is the narrowing of the gap in attainment between children with special educational needs and their peers who don't have special educational needs. And I think the point that was made earlier, I have put some data in about where we are in Lincolnshire. In some instances, we're not far apart from other parts of the country, but nevertheless, those gaps are still there for young people with special educational needs and disability. But actually what might be helpful to present in future, because we've been doing more work around this, is not only looking at attainment, because we could probably say that children with special educational needs are not necessarily going to reach the same levels as some of their non-SEN peers. So actually, when we start to look at progress, what we would expect is that children with SEN who have got this level of intervention, we would still expect to see progress on a par with their peers. And actually, what we're seeing is that just doesn't follow. They're not making the progress either. So it feels like our budgets are obviously under enormous pressure. I've included just a current draft trajectory. We're already which is on page 54. Sorry, we're already forecasting 4.5 overspend this year. Our budget was 91 or just under 92 million, and we're currently forecasting at the end of September expenditure of 96.6 million. But with the current draft trajectory we've got, it indicates at this point in time that the allocation for 21-22 could be as high as 102.4 million. So we need to really think about not only the financial investment, but the levels of support and the interventions that we're using to assist these young people alongside the outcomes that we've got. So I have included some of the data for you to look at, but as I said, I think we want to develop that further, and we really want to look in a bit more detail at progress as well, because progress is obviously an important element of that. So what are we proposing to do in Lincolnshire? On page 55, I've tried to capture what is an extensive programme of transformation for children and young people in Lincolnshire. This is being done in partnership with schools, colleges, early years settings. We know that we've got a really strong partnership in Lincolnshire, across the sector, and also with our health colleagues, our parent carer forum, and we're building on that partnership. So the work that we've done so far has involved people from all of those sectors. And what we've come up with is something that we've called the Inclusive Ambition. It's Lincolnshire's Inclusive Ambition. And our aim is to have a far greater focus on the graduated approach, that SEN support, but that actually everybody understands. So we're talking about not only families understanding that as well, but also social workers, early help workers, youth offending workers. We want everybody to have a much clearer understanding of what that graduated approach actually means, and that focus is about getting the right support for the right children at the right time. We want to really ensure that mainstream settings have a strong knowledge and understanding of supporting children with additional needs, but actually are able to use a more sophisticated way to teach social and emotional skills. Many of you will recognise a number of these young people, their social and emotional skills are really limited. And we particularly want to think about young people that have suffered trauma. We know that lots of young people are diagnosed with things when in actual fact the underlying issue is trauma, and trauma has a massive effect on both cognitive ability and their emotional functioning. So we want to really think more about that environment that the child is in, what creates some of those difficulties, rather than seeing the child as the problem and the impairment being within the child. That greater focus on need and actually understanding what the child's need is, and coupled with that, moving then away from exclusions, because I think we all know that behaviour, which is obviously what usually results in children being excluded, is actually a communication of needs. So being able to kind of understand that, so that we can include children and include their families in understanding and building on the strengths that families have got, to make sure that we've got a crossover between the education setting and the home setting, so that we can apply more consistency and help families to support their children as well. And then finally, something I don't think anybody would disagree with, we just want to continue to have high aspirations for children and young people with additional needs. And that we do want that to mean higher academic achievement. We want to give them the opportunities of building on their resilience. We need to work more in a strengths-based way. Often we see in my service, when we get requests for education, health and care needs assessments, they're very deficit-based. It's all about what the child can't do, but we don't often see what the child's strengths are, what their interests are, what the family strengths are. So we really want to build on that, and as I say, get that crossover between the child's family life and those working with the child in other settings and other arenas as well, in addition to what happens when they're in school or they're in other education settings. So I set out under the Inclusive Ambition the 10 ambitions that we've got. I don't propose to go through all of those. I'm sure you've had an opportunity to read, but that's essentially underpinning what I've been talking about in terms of those broad themes that we've included in the inclusive ambition. And so what I really want to kind of focus on lastly in terms of the transformation work is what we've been doing so far to actually support the inclusive ambition to date. So in early September the 9th, we launched Lincolnshire's Special Educational Needs and Advice line, which is to support professionals in finding solutions easily and quickly. We recognise that if settings are unable to find what they need, then the obvious next step is to apply for an educational health and care needs assessment. And we have recognised that we probably haven't had that in Lincolnshire in the way that we should. It's not as strong as we want it to be. And sometimes just for Senko in particular, where they're wondering where to go next, what might be available to them. We know from the graduate approach briefings that we do with Senkos every term that a lot of that ends up being sharing of good practice. Some Senkos know there's information available, they know where to go for support, others have never heard of it, they share all the time. So we need that to be more consistent across Lincolnshire. So the advice line provides that opportunity to have somebody that can signpost, give advice, and where necessary, if the call handler is not able to address the question or give the advice appropriately, or doesn't feel that's within their knowledge base, then we can refer on to some specialist support that can do a callback. This is not about circumventing processes, and it's not about fast tracking into specialist services. It's about getting that advice and guidance that will hopefully enable the setting to continue to manage that young person through the SEN support that the setting has in place. The second big issue and exciting thing that we've got is that we have now rolled out the Valuing Send tool, which is both an approach and a tool. We've had lots of Senkos attend the briefings that we've done so far, and I think this has been mentioned in a number of other arenas. But the Valuing Send tool is something that we really are encouraging schools to use, and in particular, throughout the whole of the child's SEN journey. So it can be used at that very early stage of identification of need. It can be used later on. If a child is going into the statutory pathway, then we're hoping that schools will be using that so we can see really good evidence of how the setting has been able to map out what the child's needs are, mapped against the offer that the setting has, so that we can actually see the gaps and see whether those gaps can be plugged easily, or whether the child really does need to go through a statutory process. So it's designed to provide a rounded picture of the child's needs, and then to use that as a foundation for planning and commissioning of support, and then being able to monitor that child's progress. We're also in the process of developing a revised graduated approach guidance document. We have had one for about 3 or 4 years now. We now know that some people use it. Some people used it in the early days but don't use it anymore. Some people have never used it. Clearly, it's not doing the job we wanted it to. And actually, the introduction of the Valuing Send has given us an opportunity to really reflect on what do we want in terms of practice standards in Lincolnshire, so that we've got greater consistency for children and young people when they're receiving support, but also if they're coming into the statutory process, that we can actually benchmark against what we would have expected at an SEN support level prior to any statutory assessment. So the inclusion toolkit, as we're calling it, is currently being devised now. And we are hoping that will go live in January, and we will do some more work to try and embed that, to introduce it and have a proper launch, so that people are really clear about the practice standards that we're hoping to establish in Lincolnshire. We want that to be a document that also families can understand, so that parents can also see what settings are able to offer, because as some of you will know, sometimes families want children in a statutory process and they want a legally binding plan, and schools are quite happy that they feel that the child's needs could be met within the setting and they don't need a statutory plan. So we're sometimes at odds there as well. So we want to be able to give families that confidence as well, to know what settings are able to offer before there's any need for a legally binding document. We are doing more work to strengthen the local offer. Again, we know from the Parent Carer Forum surveys that the local offer is underused. Some people don't even know about it. It is a statutory duty of the local authority to host that on behalf of the local area. It has been there since September 2014. It's been revised and revamped and still not used to any great extent. So we are really working on the local offer to make it much more interactive, to make it something that people actually feel they can go to if they want to find out information, and that applies to families and children and young people themselves. Our Lincolnshire Young Voices, that are young people with additional needs, they've done some great videos that are on that local offer as well, and they're trying to make it as accessible as possible. But we're also trying to make sure that actually it becomes a local offer that first and foremost helps signpost people to support way beyond ever needing to be in a statutory process, rather than the first advice they see is about how to get an educational health and care plan. And I want to reiterate, want to sort of emphasise, this is not about just saying we don't want children to have EHC plans. It's about us making sure that the children that really do need an EHC plan get one, but actually those that could have their needs managed without one are also able to do that. And just on that point, we did, as part of the early work that we did to inform what we're doing now, an audit was done of children with education, health and care plans. And in 69% of those cases, the children, it's not that they didn't require an EHC plan at that point in time. What we found was that actually, if children had had early intervention at a much opportune point in their journey, they wouldn't have required an EHC plan, or we could have delayed that. And you know what that then makes us more concerned about is then, you know, if we're delaying children's progress because we're not getting the right support to them at the right time, then that makes it even harder for them to catch up. And actually, issuing an EHC plan is probably not going to be the golden ticket that people sometimes think it might be. And then the last couple of things. Workforce development, we've already been doing a huge amount through workforce development with the special school project, the Building Communities Specialist Provision, and we're now at a point where we're able to build on that, and that's really exciting because that's actually building on an awful lot of information that's already out there, training that's already out there, taking best practice from some of the work teaching schools have done to actually, it's not about reinventing the wheel, it's about putting it together to make sure that we can offer training to an appropriate standard for whatever person, whatever the role of that individual is. And again, we want that to be accessible to our partners, and our health colleagues are certainly very interested in that, but actually to other local authority officers, so that actually this becomes everybody's agenda rather than it being seen as an education issue. It needs to be everybody's agenda. So that's it's something that is very exciting and is being rolled out now. There's still more work to be done, but it's well on its way now. And then finally, the development of a performance framework. We want to make sure that actually, if everybody's going to own this agenda, the performance framework that we're using is visible to enable everybody to be accountable to it. We're trying to establish something that then is fairly straightforward to understand, so that anybody looking at it can also see the part that they might play in some of that performance framework. And then the very last point, which is about redesigning the statutory pathways, not redesigning the code of practice. The code of practice is the code of practice. But actually, what we need to do is to get some consistency, because we know there is inconsistency. It's certainly at the graduated approach level. We want to be able to establish practice standards, be clear about what the expectations are, so that if a child is coming in for statutory assessment, we're applying the same sort of benchmarking across the board, and that certainly at the moment isn't the case. So that's the work that we've done around transformation, which we really do hope will start to make a difference to young people first and foremost, but obviously we would also hope it's going to make a difference to the budgets as well. And then the bit about COVID-19, and we felt it was probably really important just to give you an update on the impact that COVID-19 has had, particularly on our special educational needs cohort. Obviously, you're all very well versed in what happened back in March with this closure of schools. And as you will all be aware as well, children and young people with EHC plans were included in a vulnerable group that had a right to continue to attend school, albeit the advice was that children were safer to stay at home. So we know that many families elected to keep their children at home because they preferred that support through online resources and school packs that education settings provided, and rather than putting their children at potentially increased risk of contracting COVID-19. So we did an extensive piece of work within the local authority, linking in with all educational settings. So we know that all settings did risk assessments for these young people. And then we internally in the county council did risk assessments and triangulated that between the SEND teams, the schools assessment, and then our social workers, where children were open to social care as well, just to be really clear about those children that we felt were most vulnerable and where actually their level of vulnerability would have meant that actually it was preferable for them to be in school every day, rather than actually being at home where there may be greater risk to them for other reasons, rather than being in a setting where they were out and about in the community and they may contract COVID-19. And I think that was a really good piece of work that we did collectively. And we worked very closely with our health partners as well, particularly where children had complex health needs. So the local authority contacted all, at that time, 5,000 plus, now 6,000 plus, but at that time, 5,000 plus families that had education, health and care plans. And actually, we've had really positive feedback from families. They felt incredibly well supported from the sector, from their, children's settings. We know that some settings where children were particularly vulnerable and weren't in school, there were some settings contacting families every day. And generally speaking, families have said, they were overwhelmed by the care and concern that settings, the local authority and our health partners showed in terms of making sure that they were okay, they were having their needs met, they've got access to the things that they needed to get. So that, difficult circumstances, but very positive. We did have a relaxation in legislation in April, and that was around our timescales, the 20-week timescale, but also around provision. Obviously, government acknowledging that the provision which is in children's education, health and care plans, that's those legally binding documents I referred to, it wasn't at all possible to be able to continue to deliver that provision. And so there was some relaxation in the legislation. Families in Lincolnshire appreciated everything that school settings did. We had very few complaints from families at all, very few. I mean, I'm talking, I'm aware of, less, I can count them on one hand. Families they felt so well supported. They understood that the full provision in an EHC plan couldn't be delivered, and were grateful for everything that settings did. And in terms of our timescales, we actually didn't have to apply any exemptions in Lincolnshire. We have been able to carry on using technology, continued with assessments, and our timescales haven't suffered at all over that period of lockdown. And the relaxation now, the legislation is ended, so we don't have any relaxation anymore in any event. We had quite a bit of correspondence for families and for children and young people with special educational needs, and we shared that through schools, settings, Parent Carer Forum, and also published everything on the local offer. And again, I've not been made aware of people saying that they didn't feel they had information. I think families generally felt that they got the information they needed, and they were kept informed of what was happening. In terms of the special schools, which obviously have a large number of our very vulnerable young people in, 18 of the 19 special schools were open throughout lockdown. Only one of them was closed because there was only one young person that needed to go in, and actually they were able to go to one of the other special schools where they actually already knew the staff as well, and some of the other pupils. So they weren't disadvantaged in any way. And the numbers varied. They varied from 6 to 65 at any one time in the setting, but actually as lockdown progressed and families were finding it particularly difficult with some of their young people and having them at home all the time, some of those numbers went up. And then last but not least, but I think really importantly for Lincolnshire, as we started to prepare for children going back to school in September, we undertook a fairly extensive and detailed activity with our public health colleagues, the NHS specialist nursing teams, the clinical commissioning group, transport and my area of service to plan for those children with very complex medical needs, in particular those children that require aerosol generated procedures. And although I haven't actually said this in this report, I can confirm as of yesterday, of the 52 children in Lincolnshire that require aerosol generated procedures, only 2 of them are not back at school. And both of those are not because nobody's willing or it's not possible. It is because actually they're very unwell and they're not able to return to school at the moment. And that is very different to many colleagues across the country. There's a lot of, agitation amongst parent-carer forums across the country because some of these very complex needs young people haven't been able to go back to school. They haven't been able to organise fit testing and training for full PPE. They haven't been able to arrange transport, and settings have felt they would have been unable to take them back. We've not had that in Lincolnshire. I think it's absolute credit to everybody that's done their level best. And it's not just special schools. There are a number of young people with aerosol generated procedures that are in mainstream schools as well. And all of them, bar the 2 that I've talked about, have been able to return. So very positive. So really that brings my section to a conclusion. You can see we've got an increase in the number of young people with SEN, an increase in the number of young people with education, health and care plans, an increase in the number of young people going into special schools, and the pressures on the high need budgets have been well rehearsed throughout the course of this meeting. We do believe that we need some system change to be able to address the challenges that we've got, and the partners that we've been working with so far have been very positive about that. So there is a real commitment, as far as we can see, that actually everybody believes we can do something different so that we can get the best support for these young people, improve outcomes, but not see this spiral out of control in the future. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Sheridan. Have we got any questions, please, for Sheridan following her report? If you can indicate that in the chat for me. Martin Kyle.
Thank you for that report. Thank you very much, Sheridan. Just looking at page 54, you talk about there's on the building communities a specialist provision strategy, how in a very short space of time, unless things change, they're going to be filled. What is the time scale for that? What are you thinking for numbers?
Well, we're just doing some trajectory work at the moment because, initially we hoped that that was going to future-proof us for the foreseeable future, at least sort of 10 years' time. But actually, of the 527 places that we were increasing, we already know that because the special schools have, through one means, various means and another, and converting every last inch of space, we're already, we've already seen an additional 88 places be created over the last year. So we've already cut into that 527, and if we keep increasing by 4% every year, we're probably looking at maybe 3 or 4 years, and those places will be filled. So we are doing some trajectory work to be a bit more accurate on this. But again, we do believe that we can address some of that if we can get more of a revolving door. Our special schools are telling us that they have children and young people who are ready to return to mainstream, and we need to work out how we do that in the safest possible way to give them the best chance, to give parents confidence, and also to provide confidence to the mainstream sector that the support is going to be there to transition them back. So parts of transformation work will be looking at that as well. But at the moment, I think probably 3 or 4 years at most, and obviously the programme, the capital programme, doesn't come to an end until 23-24. So almost as the programme comes to an end, the places could be taken by the time we end the programme.
Okay, I think that's a really interesting figure, that one, because 4% of 80 is a different number, but we usually see how those numbers, and let's hope there is plenty of space on that project. And on page 55, you talk about the Lens project, how it's done some closing of the gap. So we're all talking about measuring outcomes, and we say that the Lens project has actually been successful in achieving that. What's the thoughts for the future of the Lens project, given the success?
I'm going to ask Martin to comment on this if you don't mind, but obviously that's not for children with EHC plans, it's children on SEN support. But in terms of the future of it, I'm not directly involved in it, so I don't know whether Martin would want to pick up that in terms of the future of it.
Hi everybody, thanks Sheridan. I think it's part of a broader discussion with partners. Certainly the Lens project and whole school send and workforce development's definitely on the cards. We're currently having a conversation with those providers at the minute to figure out how that can be delivered. with consistency, but also being targeted in the right areas and the right schools. But as Sheridan said, Lens was very much about embedding education support for SEND, and has been really popular. Obviously, we would have liked 2020 data to demonstrate continued impact, but as you well know, Martin, COVID impacted slightly on all assessments for us, unfortunately. But yeah, we're having those conversations. It's not disappearing, and it should be part of the landscape for schools to use.
Thank you, Martin. And just one final point. All these things you've talked about, Sheridan, I think are going to support the sector. And you mentioned some people see this as a golden ticket, but you've looked at it and 69% don't. If early intervention happened, it could support the costs. You talk 69% of a 100 million budget almost. That's like 70 million. So is there anything for our early years providers so they can get something that isn't an EHC, that is that early provision, that comes at a cost, but is a cost over a shorter time that won't last to 25. It's almost like an EHC, but one that doesn't last till the 25.
That's a very good question. We don't obviously there's delegated funding to schools. As I said to you earlier, the biggest increase that we see in early years is just as children are about to transition into primary. So I think we do need to understand that a bit more, because there seems to be a feeling that they're not going to cope with that statutory schooling. But then we see it again from year 6 to year 7. We see that increase again where they're not going to cope in secondary. And so we go down that route. It's something that we are discussing in terms of whether there is a possibility to make some small amounts of funding available that are not an EHC plan, but actually might allow the setting to do something different. Colleagues that have been involved in this work will know that we are treading fairly carefully with that, not because we don't think it could be a good idea, but we've also looked at areas that have previously done that. One area in our own region has done that over a 2-year period to try and prevent, to bridge that gap and actually give the support that looked to be apparent. And what they're worried about is that now they're doing an analysis of it, what they've seen is in actual fact it's been used as a stepping stone to get an EHC plan. So they've delegated additional funding and then still the child's gone into statutory provision. So I think it's not off the table. It's something we're looking at, we're considering what would that look like, what sort of, if it's an amount of money, what would the expectation be around how that would be used, and what would that mean then, because once the money's gone, the money's gone. So does that make sense, Martin?
It does. It sounds chicken and egg, but it sounds like part of what we're saying is if it gets there earlier, it could be part of the solution. And it's almost like an investment may be needed in order to see whether that's true or not, I guess. But thank you for your answer. Thank you, Sheridan.
Okay, thanks. Can we just move on to Professor Durans then for his next question, please? I'm just conscious that time is getting away with us. Professor Durans.
Have to be placed outside Lincolnshire in order to try to meet their needs. I'm sorry, did you hear me?
No, just say that one more time for us.
Yes, I was just wanting to ask, Chairman, how many of our children with SEND difficulties are we having to place outside of Lincolnshire to try to meet those SEND needs?
At the moment, actually outside of Lincolnshire, we've probably got around about 100, but that isn't. We are lower than many other places, but that doesn't account for all of that expenditure and independent provision, because we also have children in independent provision in Lincolnshire as well. So some young people go out of Lincolnshire, some as day pupils, some in residential, and some of those young people are looked after children as well, and they're in a setting because of their social care needs as well as their education needs. But I think to split it, and I haven't got the figures in front of me, we need to look at all of it, because some are in independent provision, which is in Lincolnshire as well as independent provision outside of Lincolnshire. And in terms of that overall number, it's higher than 100. But yes, but in independent non-maintained provision, we're round about the 100 mark. I can't say exactly off the top of my head because I haven't got the figures in front of me.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Right, thank you, and thank you, Sheridan, for your reports. We'll note the contents, and then we'll move on to item number 11, please. So we're going to the report on early years response and recovery. That's on pages 61 to 72 of the report pack. Michelle Andrews, Service Manager for Early Years, please. Are you there?
Hi, Gavin. Yes, I'm here.
Good.
Okay, so I'll take you briefly through the paper. Obviously, we provide an annual report each year, obviously, and the last report due to the COVID outbreak was in June 2019. So the report we presented today spans the gap between that point and the current day. So what we've done, we've set out our responsibilities as an early years and childcare service. We support a diverse marketplace of 933 providers. That does change on a very regular basis. We have different numbers of childminders and independent and voluntary provision opening and closing, as you'd expect within that kind of marketplace. And it sets out also our responsibilities for provision of childcare for older children up until the age of 14 or 18 for children with special education needs and disabilities. We also then set out, just for people who need to be more familiar with the work that we do, the budget that we set out. Obviously, we won't go into that any details. Mark says that's usually our January paper when we set out our work work around the financial elements of this, but just so people are familiar with how much the work of the early years sector costs and what does the funding look like. Underneath that, then we set out the 6 areas, high level areas that children and early years support, and 5 of those are funded through this budget, and 0.6 there around our partnership work and children's centre services are funded from non-DSB, just for clarity for colleagues around the room today, the virtual room as they call it. So we've set out the 9 priorities that we set out in June 2019, and what I've done there to try and keep the paper as brief as possible was to just give you an update, an overview of where we are with those progress. I do want to give you some assurance that between June and the start of the pandemic, a significant amount of work was done on progressing some of those, although some of them needed to come to a standstill because of the work that needed to be prioritised around COVID, and some of the financial work needed to be suspended so we didn't negatively impact on the sector more than the concerns about the sustainability due to the outbreak. So with the work around the work around the deprivation funding, which I know the School Forum particularly has requested in the past, we took guidance both nationally and regionally, and it was felt that this really wasn't an appropriate time to be undertaking that work. So we have suspended that work, and we will return to that work when we feel it's appropriate, and perhaps we can give you a further update in January on what the financial situation looks like once we've had guidance from the government about what the funding may look like going forward for the sector. So in addition to that, our audit work around the financial functions of the early years entitlement changed much more to around the financial viability of the sector and support from them through the outbreak. But apart from that, the other priorities that we set out there around the local government peer review, that was really very successful. We completed that in November, and we presented a report back to colleagues both at schools, leadership and management briefings and the head teacher briefings. So hopefully everyone heard the success of some of those. And we also followed up with further embedding some of our virtual offer that we have been able to look at through the pandemic with our health colleagues, and actually built upon that work and really had further uptake of our 2.5-year-old integrated review, which is really actually something we're going to build on going forward, and is one of the success stories of COVID, if there are only a few. In addition to that, the postponement and to the timetable of the Professional Development Fund was led by the DFE, and that continues to be extended now beyond this financial year. So again, once that programme restarts, I'm pleased to say that all of the training was successfully completed in a blended way, some face-to-face prior to the pandemic, and then the rest of the training was completed in a virtual format, and all of our Lincolnshire participants completed that first phase phase of the programme successfully. So that was excellent news. And also the work around understanding the school readiness and the early childhood strategy has also managed to come to a pause at the start of the pandemic, and wasn't able to be presented to the Children and Young People's Scrutiny Committee in April as planned. But we have now reinstigated that work, finalised the strategy based on the feedback we've received from a wide range of partners, and that was presented in September. So that's really ready to launch now as we go forward into the autumn term, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that. With regard to the launch of the Joint Strategic Needs Assessment for early years, that work was completed, and we do have an early years chapter, and that links very much embedded within our strategy, and also is there available for schools and other partners locally through the Lincolnshire website, and also then gives you data and a variety of elements that you can do looking at your local communities. So again, that's a really, really successful piece of work that happened last year, and a lot of work went into that. And finally, the work with Ofsted around promoting the changes to the Education Inspection Framework for 2019. Those briefings were completed, and we had over 300 participants. So lots of really positive work that happened prior to the pandemic starting. And then, similar to Sheridan, what we've tried to do is set out the work that we have prioritised in the last 6 months to support our providers. It has been a very tough 6 months, and I'm absolutely positive those tough times are still to continue. I'd like to thank Julia Merivale for her comments. I appreciate she has left the meeting today, for her comments about the support she has, the sector has received. And I feel the team have worked exceptionally hard and flexibly to change some of our what were face-to-face support onto a virtual forum to ensure that they do have both advice and support with regard to the extenuating changing parameters that they were dealing with very early in the pandemic, but also about the planning and sustainability and sufficiency of provision as we're going forward. So just moving through the report, I mean, obviously you've had an opportunity to look that through. I won't go through all of it in too much detail, but what we wanted to do is set out how we reacted to that in the early part of March till June, and then what we've done since June to kind of help providers build upon some of that work once they were wider reopen. We had 55%, providers remain open throughout lockdown, right from the start of when the whole country went into that lockdown position. And we had a wide range of children, both key workers and children from our vulnerable groups, that access provision throughout of that. And I really thank the providers for all of the work that they did on that. Also, there was other financial support made available nationally for some childcare providers, depending on their grant status and their governance status, And so, again, we've set that out for information for colleagues that might not be as familiar with that. As we move through the report, we also then set out the training that was available and how we moved our training offer very quickly online, and how we've managed to then negotiate some of our first trade training, which is an essential part of the criteria for Ofsted provision. Registered provision, and we've managed to develop a blended offer now that is available from the autumn term. As we move on to page 68, we then did a wider response to what was put in place during and the gradual reopening, and we set out then how we supported providers, and an initial survey that we did around providers with concerns about their financial viability, and 55% of childcare providers reported they hadn't completed a cash forecast, and we were very concerned about that. So we have put some additional short-term capacity into the team to focus providers on managing their financial cash flows and ensuring that they have got the right staffing levels for the reduced number of children that may have been in settings over the summer, but also as we move into the autumn term. We set out a range of other elements that we've done, work with our LSCB colleagues about ensuring safeguarding training was accessible and still available. And we've also offered early days training through our children's centres, which is much more direct work with our early years teams and parents directly who've had babies during the lockdown process. So all of this covers the work that we did with our partners through our children's centres and with our early years providers across the pandemic. And as we move into the recovery phase from September, although we are obviously all concerned about what the future holds with regard to any lockdown possibilities, we are looking to restart and engage with our providers that are less than good, and we have been doing that in a virtual way, and we'll continue to do that as some of the Ofsted work then regarding inspections then begins to come back into the fore. The biggest, I think, concern for the sector is the sustainability and sufficiency of provision. So that will be a huge focus for us going forward. The current projections are suggesting there are less children in early years and childcare places at the moment than there were at the same period last year. However, we do feel there may be some children that have moved provision and may not go back. And so we're looking for, as we go through the autumn term, we'll be doing a lot more work with our providers about what their sufficiency position is, what places they have available, and mapping that out to ensure we can meet the needs. I think what we are concerned about with regard to the early years sector is as more families come out of work or access universal credits, that will change the amount of children eligible for 2-year-olds, and that will increase the number of children and number of places needed for 2-year-olds. But equally, as 30-hour children are registered by and eligible on a financial basis of their parents' employment, then actually we might see that changing as the employment market changes and a less demand for 30-hour places. Obviously, over the last 3 years, we've done a lot of shifting in the sector to be able to accommodate that, and we may need to shift that back to accommodate the different requirements of the communities across the county, as we know they are very different. So I'm hoping that sets out. We've also put some numbers in there for people who want to more information about the take-up of places. And we finally then set out our plans for the coming year, which is to launch the early childhood strategy, ensure the sufficiency of the sector and look at working with our sector on provision of childcare and early years places, support the delivery of good quality practice across the county and maintain a focus on the delivery of good quality practice, maintain the delivery of our community-based activities to make sure within our children's centres, when it's safe to do so, we offer a wider range of services on a face-to-face basis. And we prepare for the further escalation of the restrictions, enable that we can react and respond effectively to support the delivery of childcare places for our key workers and our sector across the county. A final word was around the changes to the foundation stage and the development matters, and we're expecting that we've got 40 schools that have nominated themselves to be an early adopter of that, and we will work with those over the next 12 months, and following that work will then be expected to be adopted by all providers across the county. So I hope that gives you a flavour, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Gavin, back to you.
Thanks, Michelle. Have we got any questions at all? Can you please put your speak in the chat function for us if you've got any questions for Michelle? Nothing popping up yet. So within this report, we are asked to agree with the priorities for early years and childcare for 2020-21. So I'm happy to propose that, but can I have a seconder, please, that we're going to agree with those priorities? Simon Morley has seconded that. So are there any members that wish to abstain on that vote? Anybody wishing to vote against? In that case, the proposition is carried. Thank you very much, Michelle. Appreciate your time. And we'll move on to item number 12, which is the Academies and Trust update on pages 73 and 76 of the pack. I'm right in thinking Lizzie's going to present this one for us. Or Mark?
Yeah, hi, Gavin. Lizzie's had to deal with some childcare matters, so I'll pick it up. So yeah, in terms of the Academies and Trust update, so the purpose of this report is to provide information of the latest numbers of academies and pupils in academies. So touching on to page 73, in terms of the position as at the 1st of September 2020, the pupil figures will be based on the January 2020 census. So since the last report, which was presented in the January 2020 School Forum based on December 2019 3 primary schools have converted to academies. So those are Thirlby, Spalding St Paul's and Deacon St James. What that means for the primary position is that 39% or 109 primary schools are now academies out of 281. So overall, from a sector perspective, what that means is 180 academies across Lincolnshire with 185 maintained schools. So as you'll see across 73 and 74, you'll see the position what we have presently. We've also then built in a 6-month forecast up to the 1st of March 2021, and those that are currently in the process of an academy conversion. So we have 2 further primary schools. What that would mean is that the number of academies would rise to 182, or 75,000, representing 70%. So in terms of the actual sector, it's broadly, in terms of the numbers, are shared between that in academies and also maintained schools. But what you'll see there is actually the largest proportion of pupils is actually in the academies. So the larger schools have converted. So what we've also detailed there is the list of academy trusts within Lincolnshire that are detailed there. And it just gives you some sort of perspective of those Lincolnshire, those trusts that have a number of Lincolnshire schools. And then overall, just again, an overall summary, there are 35 active multi-academy trust operators within Lincolnshire, and they total 138 of Lincolnshire academies that are part of those multi-academy trusts. So yeah, this is just a briefing paper, just to give you a sort of an overall high-level view of how the market is in terms of those within the maintained school sector and also academies. So it's just to note the contents of the report. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thanks for stepping in. Any comments from Mark on that one? It's just our usual standard update. So, yeah, thank you for that. Moving on to item 13, which is the work programme. This is the opportunity that I think we talked about earlier, Martin, for you to give us a bit of an update around some of the sector-led stuff, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, and I'll be appropriately brief as well.
You're a star, thanks,
you. Chair. So just 3 brief points. One, just to reflect on the excellent support I felt as a head teacher as well that the LLPB did in terms of providing schools with guidance during the COVID outbreak and how to get set up and make sure you're doing the right thing. So thank you for that and to acknowledge that. Point 2, just to share that I can't remember where we're up to in terms of keeping the forum informed, but there's the LLPB, the Learning Partnership. There's also SEG, the Strategic Education Group. That was a smaller temporary group, a subset of the LLPB. That's growing in size now, and that's kind of changing its function. So I think maybe that's part of the work programme in January, when we'll get an update on how SEG and LLPB work and snug together nicely. And the third and final point is the chairmanship is changing at the LLPB. And just to acknowledge the excellent work by Suzanne Scott in leading that group and being chair of what is a great group of people coming together to do the best to support the sector. Whether we've got enough money for flowers.
Above my pay grade, that one, Martin. But yeah, second that. Well done to Suzanne for all her contributions. So hopefully, in terms of the work programme moving forwards, you can see what's laid out there for the next meeting. I don't think there are any additional items that we're aware of to add to that at this stage. So if everyone's happy with that, we'll move on just to look at the future meeting dates. They're shown on the agenda for your information, but the next meeting is Thursday, the 14th of January at 2021. At 1 o'clock, 2021 at 1 p.m. I'm assuming we're going to wait and see, but I think that'll probably be again an online meeting. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attendance today and for your willingness to try out this new virtual version, and special thanks as well to those at the local authority for enabling us to continue with our regular meetings as we go forward. So thank you very much for your attendance, and we shall see you, if not before, on the 14th of January. Thank you very much indeed.